Hello, everyone. Welcome to the seminar. Very nice to see all of you here. It's always great when our students, PhD and other students, come to seminars, given how hard you guys are working. Wonderful also to see visitors from off campus as well as regular faculty. It's a great pleasure to introduce Professor Zoltan Barany on my left, who's an old friend, young friend from many years back. He holds an endowed chair in governance and politics at University of Texas, Austin. I'm not going to go through a full CV, but just to highlight that Zoltan is a big name scholar on armies and civil military relations. And his books include Armies of Arabia, published by Oxford 2021, How Armies Respond to Revolutions and Why, which is a Princeton publication, The Soldier and the Changing State, Building Democratic Armies in Africa, Asia, Europe, and the Americas, Princeton publication, Democratic Breakdown and the Decline of the Russian Military, another Princeton publication, and many more, and prolific writer in terms of journal articles, etc. So it's a great privilege and pleasure for us to be hosting Zoltan. Just by way of introduction on the topic, in the mid-1990s in South Africa, my home country, I was involved in efforts to transform defense policy and the armed forces as we moved from the apartheid era to a constitutional democracy. And there was a voice that said, why do we need to retain an army? And this voice came partly from pacifists who are objecting on grounds of principle. There was no need to have a military. And from members of the South African Communist Party, who argued that this was a complete and total waste of money. We should spend money on socioeconomic upliftment and transformation. And in this particular context, at this particular moment, South Africa had no external threat and no domestic threat conceivably. We were the bully on the block. And we had the only significant armed forces in the Southern African region. So we have something of a peripheral debate, do we need an army or not? The defense force, which is trying to construct its new force design, has to come up with what they called a no-threat force design, because there was no rationally identifiable threat. But this was a minority voice. And the mainstream view was as follows. The outgoing apartheid white regime wanted to retain the army because their generals would remain in leadership positions for at least another 5 to 10 years, and that was a hedge against an African National Congress government. The ANC, the incoming government, wanted to retain armed forces because they thought it insulting and belittling that we could even consider that a black government, as opposed to the former white regime, would not have an army, couldn't be trusted to have an army. But above all, we had a failure of imagination. The idea, deep, fundamental, subliminal, a country is not a country without an army. What Zoltan is studying are countries without armies. And it's not nearly as weird and rare as one might think. So at least 25 countries have addressed this problem of the imagination and do not have armed forces. So that by way of an introduction on the topic. I look forward to hearing you.
Yes. Thank you very much. Thank you, Laurie, to invite me and Ari to organize it. And so, States Without Armies. And I'm going to get right into it. And if you want to ask questions in between, while I'm talking, that's okay, or we can wait till the end. But let me just go. As Laurie said, I've written some about countries with armies and how armies democratize and change and so on and so forth. And then I did think about what about countries that have no armies, and some of my colleagues thought that this was just a reason for me to go to Panama and Costa Rica and Solomon Islands. But it really wasn't. There was a method to the madness. And so anyway, I realized that there were 21 countries that are members of the UN. So UN member countries. The CIA counts like 31, but the CIA count includes also territories like the Faroe Islands in up north and places like Gibraltar, which is clearly not that. So anyway, but the assumption, as Laurie said, is that you're not a country without an army, right? And so we have our favorite dictator there, obviously, with in front of his honor guard. But basically, the assumption is that a modern state should have the capacity to be able to defend itself from an invasionary force, or at least until help arrives. And so here are, I hope you can you see the, okay, good. So these are the 21 countries in alphabetical order. And then you see that, so most of them are in, some Caribbean islands and small island states in the South Pacific. But there are 5 of them that I actually, I have one chapter in the book that's almost done, and I'm glad I'm here because if you're telling me things that I didn't know, I can still insert them into the book, like what you just said about the South African debate, or at least that it came up that maybe we shouldn't have an army at all.
For attribution.
Yes, yeah, of course. Come on, don't embarrass me. Yeah, of course. But anyway, so these are the 21 countries, but there are 5 of them that I deal quite extensively, and those are 5 countries that I spent quite a bit of time. And so these are the largest countries. And so they are Iceland, largest obviously by area. It's a 40,000 square mile country, but a small population. Costa Rica and Panama, which are in Central America, obviously. Mauritius, which is in Southern Africa, and has a population of over 1 million people, although it's also a small island state. And then I added the Solomon Islands, which is the largest, and an outlier in many ways from the rest of the country. It happens to be the only one that is not a consolidated democracy. All others are. But the Solomon Islands, it's still a democracy, but more, I would call it a fragile democracy, right? So, there are states, when you talk about states without armies, there are 4 categories. There are countries that never had armies, and there are quite a few of these. Iceland was one of them. Mauritius is one of them. A lot of countries become independent, right? Newly independent, and they decide, and it always has to be a conscious decision, a determination. We do not need an army, right? For a number of reasons, and of course, it differs greatly from when Vanuatu becomes independent from Britain, or Iceland becomes independent from Denmark in 1944, and of course, immediately it has military presence on its territory, initially to save it from potential Nazi invasion. So that's the first one. Second one, and this is the hard part, right? You had an army. You can imagine that's the hardest thing to do. You actually had an army, but you decide to abolish it. And it only happened 4 times in modern history: Costa Rica and Panama, and Dominica, 2 small Caribbean islands, Grenada and Dominica. And in the case of Grenada, some of you might remember that there was a US invasion of Grenada, and after which the Marxist regime was uprooted and the locals decided not to have an army. Now, there are a couple of, 2 or 3 countries that had no army after independence, made the conscious decision not to have an army, like Botswana. I actually did some research there a long time ago and talked to the people who were in the budding parliament in Botswana after it became independent in the early 1960s. And the person Botswana was, by the way, not even a British colony. It was a protectorate, right? Very low level sort of British dependency. And at the budding new legislature, parliament, a couple of legislators were made fun of because they thought they should have an army. And this was at that point, this is before Diamond, the terribly poor country that is mostly financed by Britain until the mid-1960s. The Gambia is also one of these countries that had no army but decided to create one. And there's only one that I am aware of, Haiti, that had an army. It was abolished. I mean, it recreated it in 2014 because the president who was heavily implicated being in a drug trade but didn't have his own gang of narco gangsters basically thought, well, we should recreate the army, and then I have my little security force that would be beholden only to me. So this is, well, you know where these are, obviously, but this is the South Pacific. There is the Solomon Islands. There is Mauritius, just out of Madagascar, and Iceland, obviously, up there, and the two Central American states. But there are countries without army on every continent but Asia. I'm not going to get into the truly fascinating history of Andorra. It really is amazing. I urge you, if you have a little time, to have a fun reading, to read about Andorran history, but they done away with their armies in 1278. And the Monaco and Liechtenstein in the 17th and 18th and 19th centuries. And all of these countries have basically been free of invasion or attack. So just because they are quote unquote defenseless didn't mean that they had any kind of attack. So this is the book. I'm going to go through this quickly, and again, just ask me either now or at the end. These are the seven major arguments of the book. That so creating it is always preceded by a critical juncture, which in political science there is, I don't know how many of you are political scientists or majors, but there is historical institutionalism, and of course there is the idea or the concept of critical juncture or formative moment. So basically, this is a historical event that something happens after, and it will be much more difficult to outdo later, right? So historical moment or critical juncture would be a coup, a military coup, or a lost war, or becoming independent for that matter, right? And so this is, of course, it doesn't mean, I'm not arguing that after every one of these critical junctures, the army would be abolished, but I am arguing that the army is abolished. If it is abolished, it will have to follow a critical juncture in history. Okay, so they all have allies and protectors, whether or not bilateral or regional organizations and so on. They have been free of invasions. They have, of course, their own law enforcement agencies for domestic, primarily for domestic public safety, but also for border security. And remember, most of these countries are island states, right? Not all of them, but all of them, I'm just thinking, with the exception of Andorra and Liechtenstein, have all of them are, have shores. They have their, the seashores benefiting from that, and therefore they also have large exclusive economic zones that need to be protected, fishing and so on and so forth. And so therefore they generally have coast guards, but they are usually very lightly armed. The reason I mention this is because sometimes there is a debate, or some critics contend that the border guards of Panama look just like the military of Honduras, right? So anyway, I argue against that, but I'm aware of this contention. So all of these are democracies, except the Solomon Island is still a functioning democracy, but it's more fragile. It has serious problems in that regard. But none of them had ever spawned an authoritarian state. Remember, the military, which is often involved in authoritarianism, there is, in fact, in an authoritarian state, the military, by definition, has to be allied with the powers, right? So there is no military, so there are no military coups, for that matter. generally, they're much better off, these countries, much better off in terms of social development, healthcare, educational standards, and so on than the countries around them. And the last point that I'm making in the book is, and will make here, is that it is hard to foresee any new demilitarized countries coming up because it is extremely difficult. And of course, you would have to foresee some sort of a major critical juncture to happen, which we can. So anyway, this is the hero of the demilitarization movement, Jose Figueres Ferrer, the president of Costa Rica, and that's the barracks behind him, which is now the National Museum of Costa Rica in San Jose. But this was the barracks where the last military was housed. Anyway, so I think I already talked about this, so I'm not going to waste my time, but it's following military coup, an army is often with foreign help abolished. And what happened in the Costa Rican case was actually a civil war, right? A civil war, very small to be sure, and the army was very small because it only had like 400 members. So we're not talking about a mass army, and this is why I make the related argument that it was far more difficult to do in Panama, which had a capable and an army of 12 or 15,000 people. Far, far more difficult, but Costa Rica was the first. And so how do they survive in the international system? We see how they came about, but how do they survive? The international system after World War II creates the possibility for not just for demilitarized states, but also vulnerable small states to actually survive, right? Because it creates disincentives for countries just simply to take them over, right? These small states, demilitarized states, rely very much, very intensively on the various international organizations and regional organizations. They'll become members of them, and the only limit of the international organization that they are becoming members of is usually financial, because of course to have a presence in these organizations and the travel and so on takes a lot of money, and they just simply don't have it. But I actually counted how many regional organizations some of these Caribbean countries, island countries are members of, and it's like 4 dozens. And a lot of them are regional. It having to do with very specific things, you know, like police cooperation, educational cooperation, and so on. And CARICOM, this Caribbean community, is the largest that involves all the Caribbean islands. But of course, they are members of the UN. They are members of larger international organizations. And the whole point is that they are very active in these organizations because as I was talking to a Mauritian legislator, and he told me that activity in these organizations is the guarantee of their survival, that they're always there, that people are aware of these small countries. Okay, so how do they survive? Again, they have some bilateral relations very often. You know, so one country, and let's just stick with the 5 main case studies. So, for instance, India, and this is what this slide is mostly about. India is the protector of Mauritius, right? To the extent that the head of the Coast Guard, the head of the Mauritian Coast Guard, is an Indian citizen who still reports to the Mauritian Prime Minister, but it's an Indian citizen simply because Mauritius doesn't have the capacity to educate people on that level of security expertise. Mauritius is very interesting also because it's well, it's interesting in many, many ways. It's one of these islands in the South Indian Ocean that actually had no indigenous population at all. And so when the Brits arrived in the early 17th century, They actually are they create plantations and bring in Africans from Madagascar and the African mainland. But after Britain rules against slavery, they are bringing in indentured servants from India. So basically, the population of Mauritius today is about 58% Indo-Mauritians, 28% Creoles from the of African descendants, and 3% each of Chinese and Europeans, mostly French. So it is not a big surprise that India is the primary protector of Mauritius. For the South Pacific, it has been Australia and the United States, but also New Zealand. For Iceland, few people are aware that Iceland is a founding member of NATO in 1949, and the only member of NATO, what is it, like 30 countries, that has never had an army, right? But what it has, it's much more valuable than a seconded army. It's a strategic position, right? So, and Panama and Costa Rica, of course, the Western Hemisphere would have the United States as its protector, and I think I covered them all. So they have bilateral treaties, defense treaties, security alliances, and so on and so forth. So in the case of Panama, for instance, it is very clear. There's a US bilateral treaty that says that if the canal, the Panama Canal, which of course is an incredibly important international waterway, is in any way the security is harmed, the United States is there immediately. Costa Rica doesn't have one. So I asked Costa Ricans, including Oscar Arias, who was the minister, or the president of Costa Rica, and I asked him, so what happens if the Nicaraguans come invading? And he said, well, it's never going to happen. But if it does happen, then your people will be here. So it's pretty. It doesn't have to necessarily be spat out, is what I'm saying. Now, so they all have the other. The last way that they survive is, of course, they have their domestic law enforcement agencies, and I purposefully put the Panamanians here because, as you can see, these are from the Aeronaval, so this is air and marine border guards. It's what they are worried about, of course, is the Darien jungle, which is adjacent to Colombia, and where all the bad things happen. I'll talk about it in a second. Anyway, so they all have some special forces. Some of them have presidential guards, but these are not. At most, they have sidearms or rifles, but not even machine guns. Okay. So the security profiles, I'm not going to go through it, but basically the point of this here is to show you how small is the number of security personnel, how little they spend on security. Like Costa Rica is notorious for spending way too little, actually. And you can see Iceland is less than between 0.1% and 2%, and so on. But if you look at the neighborhood of these countries, how many of them had coups, military coups, since the post-World War II period? And you see Colombia, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, all had multiple. Panama, remember, becomes, the invasion is in 1990. So it stops having an army in 1990. It's written into the Constitution in 1995, but of course it has none since then. The Solomon Islands was not a military coup. I expressly made that sure. It was an inter-island violence. And one of the Malaita, which is the second largest island, militants from there overturned the government for a long time, for a very short time, sorry. And the next door to the Solomons is Fiji, which had very recently military coups, but 4 of them in the last 40 years. Madagascar, next door to Mauritius, had 4. The Seychelles, which I also like to look at because it's another island country, not entirely unlike Mauritius, although much smaller, also had a very different kind of political trajectory than after independence than Mauritius. Okay, so briefly going through Costa Rica. So it was a civil war, as I mentioned before. And the interesting things, I'm just going to point out some interesting things about these countries, even though they have a lot of similarities. So the biggest problem in Costa Rica was that after 1990s, the public safety had basically collapsed. And part of this was sort of complacency. They spent very little on police, and I have all these numbers, and I'm not going to bore you with, but ridiculous numbers compared to their population, which at this point is like 3 or 4 million, but it's growing quickly. And murder rates are skyrocketing. And there is very little that they are willing to do about it until about 2000, 2005. But there is a great deal of free riding on the Costa Rican side because they're so, on the United States, because they're so wedded to social development, economic and social development. And Costa Rica becomes a major transit point for drugs and narco gangs. And when I talked to some people off the record, they said, well, we know that the US will come and make the necessary investments, and it is. It's building Coast Guard stations, whatever Coast Guard vessels Costa Rica has are in, the US is even paying for the maintenance, right? So anyway, but you talk to Costa Ricans, they're very, very proud of being in a country that has no military. It's become a serious marker of their identity, right? Okay, Costa Rican identity, that we are in a country that has no army. This is what it says. I love my country without an army, right? So Panama is very different. You might, the older one among you might remember Manuel Noriega. I like to point out that he was the recipient of the French Legion of Honor, but so was a lot of other people like Hafez al-Assad, Benito Mussolini. I could go on. So I mentioned this in the book. I just have to, since I took the trouble of reading this book about the Legion of Honor and who was given it, I had to use at least somewhat irrelevant footnote. But at any rate, there is the US invasion, and this was far more difficult, but they managed to actually, the US invasion creates the political conditions for abolishing the army. And so Panama has faced a lot more security challenges than than Costa Rica, its neighbor to the north, but it has been much more proactive. But we should also say that Panama is far richer than Costa Rica. It has a lot more money and has collaborated very closely with the US and Colombia as well. But it has also done, remember that in the year 2000, the Panama Canal reverted to Panama, and it became, Panama owns the canal and maintains it and administers it. And against the expectations of some, it has done a wonderful job of doing it. It's very transparent and doing really well. And recently, I think one of the largest projects globally, construction project, was the expansion of the Panama Canal, which, so if you go there, it's an incredible sight to see these vessels go there. Okay, so Iceland is another free rider extraordinaire. But it has, I said, the blessing of being where it is, and very small population. And I like also to point out that Iceland, which never had any damage done to it during World War II, but it was still the largest per capita beneficiary of the Marshall Plan, because they insisted to be a part of the Marshall Plan since they are a member of the Western Alliance. It has had some very good politicians, and so the Cod Wars. I'm not going to go into detail here because quite a few books have been written about the Cod Wars, but there are these 3 wars. Nobody dies except, I think 2 people by accident, but basically it's a cat and mouse thing. The Icelanders, which in the 1940s and 50s, their biggest industry is fishing, of course. And so the British from northern England and Scotland, all these trawlers come and take their fish. So they say we need to expand the, I think originally 3-mile nautical zone to 4 miles. And so they keep doing this, but unilaterally. And so of course the Brits are not too happy about this. And then they bring in the Coast Guard and so on. And the Icelanders say, well, if you don't like it, maybe we can just leave the alliance, kick the Americans out, and join the Soviets. Basically, this is what they say. And of course, oh my God, don't do that. So it's basically the NATO that is sanctioning Britain. Come on, just cool it. You can get your fish elsewhere, illegally or legally. But the point is that Iceland is the hero of the global South, because as a result of these cold wars, and I briefly mentioned it here, there are the UN and the Convention of the Law of the Sea basically agrees, I think in 1982, that the exclusive economic zone is a 200-mile zone. So you have these tiny little islands like Mauritius or the Solomons, and you just draw the ring around it. And it's massive economic zones, which some of it we already know how the riches in it, right? But as technology will develop, you can for instance, under sea mining and so on. It's amazing what they have, and so this is one more reason that they need to protect their shores. But anyway, so the point is that the Icelanders used NATO membership and US military presence there as a bargaining chip for their fishing. So Mauritius is sort of a big African success story. On any, there are, of course, I'm sure you're aware, there are many kind of organizations and think tanks that rate democracies, how robust democracies are. And remember, just because the Solomons is fragile, it is still a democracy, but it has problems, but it still has, free and fair elections and so on and so forth. Now, Mauritius is always the top in all of Africa in terms of democratic governance. And it's very prosperous. So you go there and it's just very, you see sort of social peace, because there are all kinds of different kinds of people, different color people who are all seem to be, getting along well. They all seem to have resources. There is, for instance, a mandated universal pension. They are well enough that even if you have never worked, you will still get, I think, $350, which is enough not to a month, enough not to starve or be, there are no people who are malnourished, is the point. But anyway, it has, so India is its big protector, but because it's so stable, it has received a ton of foreign direct investment. And of course, China is coming in, and there is a growing competition between India and China in terms of Mauritian economic investment and development and basically for influence. Another thing about Mauritius is that it claims that the Chagos Islands, C-H-A-G-O-S, the Chagos Islands, belong to it, and on the Chagos Islands are Diego Garcia, which, how many of you know what Diego Garcia is? Okay, some of you. So this is the largest, one of the, perhaps the most important military base that the United States has anywhere, right? Because, should I go back to the map?
Yeah, because they're not close.
Sorry?
They're not close to each other. So.
No, maybe it's too far. Anyway, so the Chagos Islands, it's I think it was about a 2-hour flight from Mauritius, but it is a huge US in the Indian Ocean, kind of in the middle of the Indian Ocean, and it's a mess. So there is a history here. Before Mauritius becomes independent in 1968, the Brits already see the writing of the wall. And in 1964, against UN rules, they create what is called British Indian Ocean Territory, BIOT. And that's and the Chagos Islands is the only one. And the UN said, because remember 1960, a lot of countries become independent, that you cannot divide these countries. You cannot just carve off spots or islands of these countries that you want. But that's exactly what happens. And so in 1964, the British, in effect, uproot, exile. There are 3,000 people who live there on plantations on Diego Garcia, and they are pushed over to, they are put on with various lies, basically, put on ships and shipped to the Seychelles, the Reunion, which is a French island, and Mauritius. And the building of the military base begins. And so it has been a major military base ever since. But in the last 20 years, this issue has become more and more important. And the UN General Assembly voted in favor of it in 2019. India was always very much in support of this. The Mauritians getting Chagos because they think that they will get some of the action there. But because of the Chinese incursion in the Indian Ocean, lately India has become far less sort of pushy about this, because the Mauritians have said that if they get it back, they will still give a 99-year lease to the United States. But the British and the United States say that, well, what if there is a different government? What if the Chinese offer you twice as much money as we will? So we can't really get into this bidding war. So anyway, this is an important issue in Mauritius, and I was actually asking a Mauritian, these are small countries, so don't be impressed when I say I talked to the foreign minister. Well, you go to the foreign minister and he has an office like your university office. But anyway, so I did talk to the foreign minister, and I said, well, how come you guys at the UN, you voted for the sanctioning of Russia after the invasion of Ukraine? Because these countries tend to be very staunchly neutral, right? They don't want to make enemies. And he said, well, and you know our history, of course, the Chagos, right? How could we not do this and expect to get the Chagos Islands back? So, but anyway, Mauritius is remarkably active in regional organizations, also terribly, really interesting place to visit. Okay, so here is the very small Mauritius Seychelles comparison. So yeah, so it's not super close. Madagascar is a huge island, right? So here is Mauritius, and here is the Seychelles, Mahe, that's the main island and the capital there. So, but anyway, what happens after the Seychelles becomes independent, at pretty much the same time as Mauritius in the late 1960s, they decide to have a military. And so this military has actually been complicit in the creation of an authoritarian regime, which the Seychelles had until relatively recently. And so you just see even though it has a much smaller population and the island itself is much smaller, their budget and in terms of police and security is twice as that as Mauritius. And the Seychelles, just as important, is very unstable, politically unstable country, which Mauritius never had this problem. And so in terms of attracting the kind of investment that you want, will make a big difference. Yeah, so I met with again, not bragging, but I met with the high command of the Seychelles military. There are the 600 strong Seychelles military. So the top commander is like a lieutenant colonel, right? So, but I did ask him the uncomfortable question of, what do you really need the military for, right? And so he couldn't really answer. He said, well, we need to have a better Coast Guard. I said, well, so the Mauritians have a Coast Guard. We don't need that, and we need to have a military if there is domestic upheaval, and this is where the dog lies, right? Domestic upheaval. So use the military against civilians. And I said, no, you just need an effective police force. You don't need that military. But anyway, I wasn't able to convince him, shockingly, yeah. So the Solomon Islands, really the outlier, right? So it's just, I think, so the poorest country I've ever been to was Tanzania until I went to the Solomons. And it's amazingly poor. Hence its designation as the least developed country by the UN. One of the biggest things that Francis Fukuyama has written a lot about, and some others, is it's for linguists, it's an incredibly interesting place because it has like almost 1,000 islands, but 80 languages. And so the languages are actually quite different. So it's not like, Czech and Slovak, or, Spanish and Portuguese. They're actually quite different languages. And so they all belong to their biggest identification. The most important marker of the identification of Solomon Islanders is one talk they belong to. And it's spelled W-A-N-T-O-K. And that's a pidgin version of one talk, like one language, right? So the point is that when they have had recurring inter-island violence and so on and so forth, the members of the police are not loyal to the institution, but the members of the police are loyal to their one talk, their small community. And this is how it has been for thousands of years. And again, shockingly, the last 40 years couldn't change it, right? So it's very unstable. Politics is very unstable, very fragile parties, constant movements, across the aisle and so on and so forth. Votes of non-confidence. So it's highly unstable. And this is what the kind of instability in a strategically very important place, because remember, Americans and Australians and New Zealanders lost thousands of people trying to save the Solomon Islands, Guadalcanal especially, from another authoritarian state. The Chinese move in and basically try to take over the country. So the US and Australia, the traditional partners, are not complicit, but are to some extent to blame, because they had in the late 1990s took their eyes off the ball when the idea was, what do we need all these embassies for, and so on and so forth. And so the Solomon Island embassy closes down. There's no tiny American presence there. And so the Chinese move in, they start building, they take over, they pay off politicians who are very easy to pay off because they're desperately poor, right? So anyway, it has changed. And if you're interested about this, I have an article in the next issue of the Journal of Democracy called, you give them a title and they always change it. I think it was how resisting China in a global South, and they changed it to China in the battle for the global South. But anyway, I talk a lot about Fiji and the Solomons and Sri Lanka, which is the cautionary tale. Some of you may know that basically the Chinese took over Sri Lanka as a result of a number of interesting factors. The traditional partner, India, would not have this very corrupt regime, but the Chinese had less scruples about corruption and authoritarianism and so on and so forth. So anyway, but it's still, the point is that it's still functioning democracy since independence, but clearly the outlier, even in that on that score, I would say from all of the demilitarized states. So the bottom line is there are tons of benefits, right? They tend to be stable, democratic, and so on. We've been through all this. Citizens have a much higher satisfaction, and there are all these surveys that all confirm this. And what's the drawback? Well, you can use militaries to build nation building exercise, especially in highly unequal countries when you have conscription and everybody is going through the same experience and perhaps meeting people they wouldn't have met otherwise, not perhaps, but surely. And their sovereignty is, to some extent, is compromised because of the alliances and the regional organizations they belong to, where obviously they have some responsibilities and not just advantages of this. So this is I showed you the barracks in San Jose. And so this is a plaque on that barracks that now is the National Museum of Costa Rica in San Jose. And so this is this was said by the president, Jose Figueres Perez, that weapons bring victory, but only loss can bring freedom. And as you can see what it says, there are flowers put in front of it by school children and so on and so forth. And, being for Costa Ricans, being citizens of a demilitarized state is huge. And so, but I'd like to, since I'm Hungarian, I'd like to end on a sour note, right? So the prospects are very poor for demilitarization. So this is on the left-hand side, you see Oscar Arias, who was the president of Costa Rica twice. And then next to him is the wonderful president, former president of Uruguay, right? Whom some of you may have heard of as peace-loving and unpretentious and so on and so forth. So Arias had campaigned very strongly for demilitarization in different parts of the world. And he was actively supportive of the Panamanian demilitarization. He wrote a very well regarded and extensively played op-ed in the New York Times about what Panama needs an army for and so on. He also was able to, well, I don't think that Jean-Bertrand Aristide in Haiti needed too much encouragement, but in 1994 when they abolished the Haitian army, but Arias was very much supportive of that. And then he had this basically a campaign in the 1990s and the 2000s of going to, he's also a Nobel Prize winner, right? In Peace Prize, 1985. So Nobel Peace Prize, so I'm a little skeptical, right? But even Fidel Castro said that finally somebody who actually merits a Nobel Peace Prize. So let's listen to Fidel. But anyway, he got it, I think, in the mid-1980s for being instrumental in the Central American peace process, which he was. So anyway, so he goes around the world trying to tell countries how much better Costa Rica is than countries with a military, and he's remarkably unsuccessful. And so he went to, like Africans say it's like Ghana, but Lesotho, for instance, which is of course one of the entirely surrounded by South Africa. What does Lesotho need an army for? One might ask. But he thought that he was a personal friend of Pepe Mujica of Uruguay, and he wrote to him an open letter that was widely published in the Uruguay media. And he was very strongly, even rudely rebuffed. And what I was surprised at was that Pepe Mujica was telling him not that the military is needed for these projects, which you clearly don't need a military for, but Mujica, who basically was a guerrilla fighter against the Uruguayan military dictatorship and spent many years in very difficult conditions in Uruguay's military regimes, prisons, said that the Army's legacy needed to be honored. And so I was in Oscar Arias' living room, and he's telling me this story, and he's slapping his knees and says, "Can you believe it?" The Army's legacy. What legacy? A legacy of repressing people for decades. So anyway, but the point is that there are entrenched military and political interests, right? And so it's very difficult to establish or to establish a demilitarized regime or to get a political a polity to accept going without this highly highly established military that in many ways, of course, the history of the is in the history of the country. And so a lot of people used to say that what is history? It's a succession of wars, right? That's what history is. So it has been so in a couple of places, and I'm glad that Laurie mentioned South Africa because I was unaware of it. But in Eastern Europe, after 1989, after communism falls, there is definitely I wouldn't say movement, that would be too strong, but the point that what do we need Slovenia, which is surrounded by friendly countries, what does it need an army for? It was mentioned, but they want to be members of NATO, and they said we cannot be members of NATO without an army, and so they have a tiny little army. And in the Czech Republic also, but it just didn't go anywhere. So in other words, the prospects are bleak. And so that's where I end that.
Great. I'm reminded listening to Zoltan in the South African case of how much that army was associated with nationhood rather than with defense.
Yeah.
So I encourage you, you can stand and I'll take some questions now. You know, when Mandela as president was inaugurated, standing next to him on the podium are the chiefs of the armed service. And they're in their finery and they have all their medals and their ribbons and all of that. And their flags are flying just below the new national South African flag. And we have the Air Force doing a flyby. And so it's intimately associated, even though the ANC was not a militarist liberation movement by any stretch of imagination, the association of state flag military was in the new South Africa just absolutely unquestioned, broadly unquestioned. I've got lots of questions, but I'm going to open it up. Any observations, questions, please?
Yeah, I guess I wanted to ask about like this idea of the army being associated with states and states without armies kind of serving as like a contradiction to that. But if these states without armies are dependent on either international organizations or other states with large armies for security, then doesn't that kind of contradict this pacifist argument that states don't need armies because they are depending on someone else?
Yeah. No, that's a good point. So yes and no. So obviously they would be very uncomfortable without, this, and they openly seek protection, but it's really sort of a last resort, and the last resort have never been, called in because they never have been attacked. Some of the, like the Caribbean countries, they actually they have the Caribbean regional defense organization, but it's not really a real thing. So I mean, they don't really need to worry about being attacked or anything. So I mean, I understand, and so I think for a larger country like Panama and Costa Rica, it is probably certainly useful to have this in the background, but I think it's still, they still would consider themselves demilitarized and not really of any kind of major contradiction.
Please.
Yeah, I think like demilitarization or militarization is the issue that very easy to be like manipulated. Because like I'm from Ukraine. And you can predict my position about militarization, because for us it's like the defense of our democracy and our like independence and style of life and human rights. We had this discussion in Ukraine too, like even like in history, because when there was a first Ukrainian state after the Russian Empire fall apart, and we had, I'm not sure about historical translation, but like something like first independence fight, we call it. So it was in the beginning of 20th century in 1917. Our first president, Mikhailo Grushevsky, it's like, I'm not sure I can call him a president, but it was something like proto-president. So he was against militarization. He said, like, we don't need army because, like, they were also very left-wing, I would say. And in Russia, there is already our friends, like, left, so we don't need army. After that, they were attacked by Soviet army. And after 3 years, unfortunately, this state disappeared and Ukraine was the part of Soviet Union. And the same was after the independence, because for the first, I would say 20 or 25 years before the Revolution of Independence and before we were attacked by Russia for the first time, our military was also like very reduced in power. They had financing, and actually like to serve in army was very unprestigious and so on. So the situation just changed after occupation of Crimea, and mostly this dialogue about demilitarization in Ukraine was facilitated by pro-Russian forces. Like pro-European forces wanted like militarization, and pro-Russian forces like used different arguments just to make Ukraine to have the weak arm as it was possible. So I think like in ideal world, when this country are sure that they won't be attacked and nothing will happen with them, it's really better to withdraw this money from defense sector to culture or culture, education. But like now when I'm looking on the pictures of the schools that were bombed, I have like a lot of questions why our army was not financed enough before 2022.
Good, great question. Thank you.
Yeah, very good question. So, well, obviously, this is not, being army-less is not for everyone. So there's a basic, fundamental tenet of international security that you need to worry about the capabilities of your neighbors, not about their intentions, because intentions can change very quickly, as we saw in this case. So the Ukraine should have a serious army, obviously, given where it is. But I think that this demilitarization option is very much would be doable for countries that don't have, nearby neighbors that could possibly threaten them. So South Africa would be a good reason. So Botswana actually militarized because of South Africa, as Laurie said, that South Africa was the bully in the neighborhoods, and Botswana decided that they had to, because of the constant incursions from the South African army into Botswana, territorial sovereignty and so on. But in the Ukrainian case, I definitely think you should have a strong army. But in the case of Uruguay, the whole idea of Oscar Arias was, who are you going to fight? Next to you is Argentina. Right? Uruguay is 2 million people, right? You have Argentina on one side, Brazil in the other. Like, what could you possibly do, right? So it was not an unreasonable, suggestion, I don't think. But so the bottom line is, I don't want to go too long, but the bottom line is it really depends on the neighborhood, right? Slovenia really didn't need a military.
But like if Ukraine, if it would happen that Ukraine, for example, would be occupied, I hope it never happened, like these countries are the next, they are neighbors to us.
Yes.
So that's why I don't think like all the old Eastern Europe can speak.
Yeah, so no, I mean, absolutely true. So I wrote 20 years ago, I wrote a book about NATO expansion, and I was actually very skeptical of NATO expansion. And then I talked to, in the case of Hungary, and for reasons that are too long to go into and kind of irrelevant. But I am reminded by an Estonian professor, a colleague of mine, who told me, we want to be in NATO because then we won't have to worry about security. And so obviously for a place like Estonia next to Russia, an unpredictable and strong Russia, it makes a lot of sense. For Uruguay or South Africa or Lesotho, it's just a waste of money that you could spend on social development.
Yeah, so just to say, it's clear that questions of principle and values and norms are intertwined with questions of politics, strategy, security, from a domestic, but more importantly here, a regional and global perspective. So it's this ensemble of considerations that are leading countries to make decisions one way or the other. Yeah, colleague at the back.
Hearing all about these countries, I wonder, what is your definition of an army? I mean, what would you consider an army? Or
Oh, okay, yeah. Well, I mean, I actually never thought about what an army, but you know, it's a standing army that would have weapons that would be, you know, tanks, and major investment in weaponry would be like it would have an air force and a navy if it has a sea, and basically something that is capable of protecting the homeland. I mean, and it's entirely geared toward external protection from external invasion, right? So it's as distinct from a police force, for instance.
But nonetheless, it's an important question.
Yeah.
So thank you.
Yeah,
and
sure.
we're thinking about whether the first 10 pages cover this in the book.
Yes, yeah.
Which is
I am talking about it.
Yeah. Because it's not it sounds like you're presenting it as binary.
Yeah.
You have an army, you don't.
Yeah.
But it could be seen as on a spectrum.
Right. No, and one thing that I spend time in the book is that it's you know, a police force. It's basically civilian, right? It's a force that is made up of civilians and not a military, you know, not part of the military profession. So civilians and civilian force that is would have basically sidearms, but not and used for public safety, but certainly not to so the function, right, not to defend from external attacks. Yeah.
Thank you. So I'm take colleague at the back, yeah, and then I'll come to you. Yes, you have the floor.
Hi, I'm Diana, second year big study student. How about Singapore? Singapore is a small country in size, and then it's also it's an island. But it happens to be, you know, I think we have a lot of military spending and training. What do you think of that? Should they?
I think, yeah, good question, very good question. I'm going to have a paragraph about that because, yeah, seriously. So Singapore, obviously independent country member of the UN, should have an army and should have a very strong army because all the countries around it that would love to take a bite out of Singapore and the prosperity and what they had built there in the last, 50 years. So that's number one. And so they have an army. So obviously they're not going to be able to beat China, right? But that's not the point. So they could make it just like Taiwan. Taiwan can make it very costly for China to invade. And that's really the point. Is it, because it's at the end, is it worth it to invade Singapore? So Singapore is an excellent army, but also the army has a major function that it is the function of a lot of armies where you have a population that is either too prosperous or too diverse, and that it creates this common experience, which is very important, right? So this is, I'm not going to go off too much here, but it is interesting that conscription was recently introduced in the 3 richest countries in the world: Kuwait, the United Arab Emirates, and Qatar. And the only reason is obviously nobody is expecting Qatar to fend off Iran. It's because of building a nation, which they didn't have before. It's lots of rich tribes. And all of a sudden now they have a 12-month obligation where all these kids who would have never met one another are now going through the same experience. And it really works. So bottom line, Singapore, good, have an army.
All right, on my left.
What about the Vatican? So the Vatican has the Swiss Guard.
Yes.
Could be a police force, but somehow it's considered an army. I don't think they have tanks, you'd see them. No, quite frankly. No, good point.
No,
Not even long enough to have a runway. And,
but they have a powerful ally.
okay, I'll give you that. Obviously, no Navy, but you know, is that like the next candidate to consider? No
Yeah,
one.
no, I mean, that's a good question, but it's really, kind of an outlier in a way, right? But they do have the several hundred. I do spend, I think, a half a page on the Vatican. And I looked into it, and so is it an army? Well, some people call it an army. So it is included in some of these lists, and it's not included in others. I think it's not a full member of the UN. I think that's my excuse, right?
Always.
Because I'm only dealing with full UN members. But no, that's a good question. And it's remarkably interesting that I looked into who can become. So they have to be Swiss citizens. So it's not just a ceremonial thing. The Swiss guys have to be citizens.
Swiss
Yes.
or Vatican?
No,
They're
well,
Swiss.
they are Swiss, and after that, their contract is done, they're going back to Switzerland.
Yeah.
And they have to have certain qualifications, just not just physical, but mental and education and so on and so forth. Yeah.
Yes. Please, yeah.
Yes.
You go.
I'm thinking specifically about the Central American cases.
Yeah.
And, the two countries, Panama and Costa Rica, both have very particular, like, imperial relationships with the US.
Mhm.
And one of the things you said was like, they don't, one of the requisites maybe to not have a military is to not have nearby neighbors that could be aggressive to you. Well, the US has been aggressive in Central America, in other countries that are oppositional to them.
Yes. Yeah.
And so I guess I'm curious about the imperial nature, capitalist, very open to US investment, very open to US collaboration. Like it seems like all of these countries have to be willing to be almost open to imperialism to a certain extent. And is that true in all of the cases?
Yeah. So, so a very good point. I mean, the US's relationship, particularly to these two, right? And so obviously with Panama wouldn't exist if it weren't for the United States wanting the canal, right? Wanting to build a canal, and the Colombia, and of course, you probably know the history more than I do, how the US supported Panamanian independence because of the canal. But so Panama has the relationship between the countries is actually pretty close and pretty genuine, right? Panamanians are pretty open about the United States, and they want more help from the US. As several people told me, this is an interesting point if you're interested in migration. The US should really support more the two Central American countries from where the citizens don't want to migrate to the United States, right? The Costa Ricans don't want to come to the United States, neither do Panamanians, or they come and then go back. So I think it's two distinct, so let me just say that I went to talk with the defense attaché in Panama, and it's a military guy, military colonel, who's now actually in Asuncion, but the US is very much involved in Panama and very frustrated because militarily or security-wise. And the biggest reason for this frustration is that there are different interests. For the Panamanians, we're worrying about migration now, right? Which has skyrocketed in the last 5 years, coming through the Darien jungle. So the US is interested in this part, particularly because of the instability, but especially because of drugs and the coming in of all kinds of, so the fourth largest of all kinds of groups of people, from Haitians, Venezuelans, and I think the third or fourth largest now is Chinese, believe it or not, coming through the Darien. And of course the drugs, the tremendous amount of drugs that come through the jungle. The Panamanians' interest is to get these migrants, because they say that they are liberal democracy and they're not going to prohibit people from, following their true will. And if they, by God, if they want to go through Panama to the United States, just let's make it as easy for them and as quick as possible, so they leave. So what happens literally is they put them on buses, they bus them up to Costa Rica, and then they let them up, they go up to Costa Rica, and then one less border to negotiate, right? So very different interests, but the U.S. of course is very much interested in the canal, and the canal now is, I mean, I could go on and on, you don't want me to, but there's increasing Chinese involvement in the canal, to the extent that I think that the Chinese now own 2 of the 5 ports, a lot of influence. And of course, the canal is very important for the US, because I think 70% of the stuff that we're getting goes through the canal. And also it's in terms of the military. I think like 2,000 American military vessels go through the canal every year, going from the West Coast to the East Coast. So Costa Rica is very different because Costa Ricans, I don't know how to put this politely, but so what we understand and couldn't approve more of is their tremendous insistence on spending as much on healthcare, education, basically social development, trying to minimize inequality and so on as possible. So we all agree with that. But they have this massive security issue, which they really don't I shouldn't say don't want to deal with. They want the United States to deal with it. But at the same time, they are hiding the fact that it's the US who is training their police in many cases, who is building, the police academy, who is also building these Coast Guard stations and so on and so forth. So as long as it is not sort of public knowledge, because the government would have a tremendous public backlash, because there is this, I wouldn't call it anti-Americanism, but basically we don't want to be reliant on the United States goodwill, but they still are. Yeah, so it's a different kind of relationship. But independence, is a huge, you're right, is a big concern for both of these countries. Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Zoltan. I've got a question on my right, and then that'll be the last question. And then if any of you students in particular want to spend some one-on-one time with Zoltan for research purposes, come and talk to me at the end of the seminar.
Yeah. Sure.
It's somewhat irrelevant footnote, but you mentioned Slovenia twice.
Slovenia?
Yes.
Yes.
And to my surprise, there's been discussions for Slovenia not having an army because it's surrounded by friendly states.
Mm-hmm.
And again, thank you, because it's not usually to hear friendly associated with the Balkans, so
Mm-hmm.
it's a surprise to me. So I just wanted to know a little bit more about that.
Yes.
Especially with regards to the dissolution of Yugoslavia, its relationship with Serbia. Of course, not a neighboring country, but Croatia is right there and all of that.
Yeah.
So, where were these discussions inspired by, considering that this being a regional recurrent threat?
Yes.
And then, if assuming, yes, Slovenia was surrounded by friendly states, and nevertheless opted in to have an army, knowing its identity complexities, do you think that some of these countries might choose to have armies, regardless of the realistic threats out there, just as a way of identifying, particularly with Western identity?
Mm-hmm.
Knowing that Slovenia has had sort of historical interest to put itself aside from the rest of the Balkans, also associated with the Austro-Hungarian Empire and all of that.
Mm-hmm.
So if it indeed was a state, did it just go into NATO because it wanted to look like a Western country?
Yeah, so early on in the there's the War of Independence that Slovenia has I don't know if you know this, but a very short war with the Serbs against the Yugoslav. Sorry? Yeah, so you know about it. Okay. So and of course the reason why that Slovenia is not really included in a big Balkan war is because it does not have a border with Serbia, right? It is, so it's fighting the Yugoslav National Army. But after that is over, they realize, what do we need an army for, and so on and so forth. And the legitimacy of these countries as part of the new, Western world is tied to international organizations. And so the European Union is it's too big a bite for them at this point, because the European Union, in order to accept new members, has very high requirements, but NATO doesn't. And so Slovenia, as long as it wants to be, as long as it's democratic, which is of course the most democratic of all the former states, it can be a member. So I was a little bit involved in this because I knew some of the people at so Slovenia actually had one of the only communist states that it had a defense department at a university, defense studies. This was not taught in other communist countries because people start thinking about things that they shouldn't, right? But Ljubljana, University of Ljubljana had one, and anyway, I knew almost everybody at that department. And so one of the guys from that department became the defense minister. And so when I talked to him, I think in 1992, he told me that Slovenia has no army. It's a joke. Let it not even talk about it. And then he became the defense minister. And so I wrote to him. His name was Anton Grizold, if you know, Anton Grizold. And so I wrote to him an email that I'm friend enough that I'm not going to take advantage of what you just said. And said, please, thank you. But so the army is really a joke, right? But in order they had to have an army, they thought, because this is how they get to be legitimate, a legitimate country. We have an army, just like Laurie said at the very beginning. If you have no army, you're not really a serious country. So they had to have one. And they have an army. They don't spend a lot of money on it, but it does, relatively good things. So, but it was a discussion on relatively high level. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
We're going to have one last question. The room is emptying for classes. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to ask you to keep it brief and respond.
Yeah. I wonder if you would talk a little bit about financial and economic incentives. Most of these countries, as you said, are democracies or emerging democracies. And I wonder about the fact that militaries are often these countries' biggest form of economic redistribution, and it's essentially a jobs program. I wonder if you encountered any motivation that was non-strategic and non-security, but rather economic motivations to keep this jobs program in flow, in motion.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So that's why to have a military, because, so in terms of economic incentives, what I had come across a lot is corruption, right? A lot of corruption that is associated with the purchasing of, police equipment, but not military equipment. So I didn't see that at all, because, but I see the point, and I think that your question, you could actually expand it to security employment. So, for instance, in Costa Rica, until 2000, so we're not talking military, but policemen were ridiculously undereducated, undertrained, and so on. And to be a policeman in Costa Rica, it was a payoff job from the candidate in your locality that you helped elect. And so there are all these, stories are legion about, and many jokes about the policemen who really just didn't know anything, weren't trained at all, because they were given these jobs as payoffs. Now later, I think in early 2000, this starts to change. I'm just looking at thinking of the countries that I know more. So of course in Iceland there's hardly any corruption. So it's really all merit-based, and it's very much about representation and so on with women, and they don't really have minorities. But in Panama, it's so the interesting thing is who becomes a policeman, right? What is the social background? But I don't think in Panama, which is an incredibly corrupt country, right? That's one of the biggest threat to democracy in Panama is corruption, really. Sorry?
It's like this, it comes from disease state, like, so.
Yes.
Panama is-
That's right. So do we have in English the Panama, that as a synonym for corruption? No. So in Hungarian, my native language, there is a Panama. It's like a major corruption deal, because I think going back in the early 20th century, there was this huge corruption scandal, and so it's like with the Panama hat, we use that,
Yeah.
but there's also the corruption. So, and then I think that in the Solomons also there is who becomes a policeman becomes somewhat of it is more of an economic incentive for people to pick policemen from the more disadvantaged groups of. But it's not really I see the point, and if you were asking me about militaries around the world, of course we could talk about that. How is that? But in these demilitarized states, that's also it's not really an issue. Yeah.